We've configured advanced AIs into experts on Middle Eastern geopolitics.
I'm a pro-Israel advocate.
I'm a pro-Palestine advocate.
And we gave them a debate forum and added 16 different AI agents to judge each argument. No human emotions involved, just cold, hard facts. Stick around to see who wins, but don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. We start by asking, does Israel have a right to defend itself from Hamas following the October 7th attacks? Or is their retaliation entirely out of proportion?
Israel's historical and spiritual claim to the land stems from centuries of continuous Jewish presence, reinforced by biblical texts designating it as the Promised Land. Zionism, emerging in the late 19th century, formalized the Jewish struggle for self-determination after rampant persecution worldwide. In 1948, Israel established statehood in a region long disputed, yet archaeological and historical records underscore a deep Jewish bond to these territories. Hamas's charter openly calls for Israel's destruction, reflecting an ideological refusal to accept any Jewish state. Their recent attacks, including hostage-taking on October 7th, highlight a rejection of peaceful coexistence. Utilizing civilian infrastructure for weapons storage, Hamas exploits its own population, creating false narratives of Israeli aggression. Israel, bound by the duty to protect its citizens, has launched a justified operation to dismantle these threats and secure its sovereign land. If a nation faces relentless hostility and sworn enemies bent on annihilation, can it morally refrain from retaliating to defend itself and its people?
Israel's response to the October 7th attacks cannot be viewed in isolation, but as part of a long history of systemic aggression against Palestinians. In 1948, the Nakba led to the forced displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians, with villages destroyed and families uprooted to make way for the establishment of Israel. This foundational act of violence created a precedent for ongoing occupation, dehumanization, and denial of Palestinian self-determination. The Great March of Return in 2018, where Palestinians peacefully protested for the right to return to their ancestral lands, resulted in Israeli forces killing over 200 civilians, including children and medics, as reported by human rights organizations. These acts of disproportionate violence undermine Israel's claims of self-defense, revealing a pattern of systemic oppression justified as security measures. In this context, retaliation against Hamas becomes a tool to perpetuate the occupation, displacing more civilians and exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. If Israel's actions consistently erase Palestinian rights and lives under the guise of defense, how can such measures be seen as legitimate or moral?
Many overlook that Hamas is designated a terrorist organization by multiple international bodies, including the US and EU, explicitly seeking to destroy Israel rather than negotiate. In conflicts like 1967 and 1973, Arab coalitions attempted to eradicate the Jewish state, forging a climate of perpetual threat. While Palestinian displacement remains a tragedy, it's equally true that Hamas has repeatedly rejected ceasefire proposals, opting to expand a massive rocket arsenal targeted at Israeli civilians. Their policy of taking hostages and embedding fighters in residential areas intensifies civilian casualties on both sides. Even the Great March of Return protests saw elements exploiting humanitarian demonstrations to smuggle weapons and incite border breaches, heightening tensions. By refusing to renounce violence, Hamas perpetuates a cycle of aggression, leaving Israel with little choice but to protect its populace. In a region where declared enemies openly vow annihilation, can Israel realistically afford to remain passive?
Israel's narrative of self-defense frequently obscures deeper realities of systemic inequality, facilitated by an ethnostate framework that privileges Jewish identity over indigenous Palestinian rights. Media outlets often amplify Israel's security concerns while minimizing the devastation wrought by recurrent military operations, such as Operation Protective Edge in 2014, which left entire Gazan neighborhoods in ruins. Tenuous international scrutiny usually follows, but the core issue remains. Palestinian civilians bear the brunt of escalated assaults without meaningful recourse or representation. This imbalance, compounded by severe restrictions on movement and resources, fuels perpetual hostility rather than deterring violence. If Israel's chosen methods repeatedly devastate civilian populations under the mantle of self-defense, can such actions still be justified as legitimate protection?
Israel's protective measures, from the Iron Dome to cross-border medical corridors, aim to shield civilians on both sides. Meanwhile, Hamas diverts humanitarian resources into weapons smuggling and advanced rocket technology, frequently supplied by external actors who exploit the Gaza populace's hardships. Though inequality remains a serious concern, it's vital to note that Israel has repeatedly offered ceasefires, which Hamas often dismisses while intensifying rocket attacks on cities like Sderot or Ashkelon. Despite international criticism, Israel's citizenship laws grant non-Jewish residents certain legal protections, and courts have sometimes ruled in favor of Palestinian plaintiffs challenging government policies. These lesser-known realities contrast with the portrayal of a monolithic ethnostate bent solely on oppression. Still, violence persists, fueled by a group that places weapon caches in residential zones, jeopardizing innocent lives for strategic advantage. When faced with an adversary prioritizing warfare over compromise, how can any nation's defensive actions be deemed purely aggressive rather than necessary protection?
Israeli officials highlight civilian protection, yet the Gaza blockade since 2007 and West Bank settlement expansions systematically undermine Palestinian livelihoods. Media coverage often centers on rocket attacks, overlooking forced displacement and severe movement restrictions that fuel resentment. The IDF's advanced weaponry imposes disproportionate harm on non-combatants, intensifying anger rather than promoting peace. Policies like forced land acquisitions, checkpoints, and resource control deepen poverty and drive conflict. Demolitions and restricted fishing zones further erode economic stability, thwarting any prospect of mutual coexistence. Rather than ending violence, these measures pressure an already disenfranchised population into submission, creating a stark imbalance where civilian casualties soar each time hostilities escalate. If thousands remain under blockade and systematic control, can such actions truly be called self-defense?
Over the years, Israel has attempted diplomatic pathways, evident in the Oslo Accords, which granted Palestinian self-governance under the Palestinian Authority. Yet Hamas's ongoing hostility, manifesting in infiltration attempts and cross-border tunnels, continually jeopardizes any chance at enduring peace. Israel's blockade on Gaza is paralleled by Egypt's own closure of Gaza's southern border, indicating regional concerns about militant infiltration, not just an isolated Israeli policy. To mitigate civilian harm, the IDF invests in advanced warning protocols and precision strikes to neutralize threats with minimal collateral damage. Meanwhile, Hamas diverts international aid from essential infrastructure, favoring weapons procurement that further endangers civilian lives on both sides. In a conflict where one faction's stated goal remains Israel's eradication, can the defending nation be expected to dismantle its security measures and risk even greater chaos?
Israel's ongoing crackdown extends beyond blockades, as seen during Operation Guardian of the Walls in 2021, which devastated critical infrastructure in Gaza and forced thousands of families from their homes. The separation barrier, deemed illegal by the International Court of Justice, creates daily hardships for Palestinians seeking work, healthcare, or education, further intensifying resentment. Child detention remains another dark facet, with organizations like Defense for Children International documenting instances where minors face harsh interrogation tactics and prolonged confinement. These policies collectively entrench despair, undermining any claim of self-defense by perpetuating conditions that fuel more unrest. If systemic barriers and punitive operations continue shaping Palestinian life, can we honestly call these tactics necessary security measures rather than an unending cycle of subjugation?
Israel's biblical and historical connection to this land predates modern nation-states, tracing back to King David's reign in Jerusalem. Centuries of diaspora, Roman expulsions, and the horrors of the Holocaust only bolstered Zionism's drive for a secure Jewish homeland. Today, Hamas's charter explicitly advocates Israel's eradication, not cohabitation or negotiation. The brutal hostage-taking on October 7th, snatching civilians of all ages, exposes an unyielding pledge toward violence rather than peaceful dialogue. Even more disturbing is Hamas's proven strategy of operating beneath hospitals, schools, and mosques, exploiting innocent lives as human shields. By embedding rocket launchers and command centers in civilian infrastructure, they force Israel into agonizing decisions when defending itself. In a region where terror groups openly proclaim their intent to annihilate the Jewish state, can Israel reasonably refrain from robust defensive measures to rescue hostages and safeguard its very existence?
Israel's biblical claim to the land doesn't negate the modern policies that systematically favor Jewish residents at the expense of Palestinian rights. Laws like the 1950 Law of Return grant immediate citizenship to Jews worldwide, yet bar Palestinian families, uprooted in past conflicts, from returning, reinforcing an ethno-national hierarchy. In 2018, the nation-state law further entrenched Jewish supremacy, declaring only Jews have the unique right to self-determination in Israel, leaving Arab citizens marginalized. Meanwhile, eviction attempts in neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah epitomize the state's selective recognition of property claims, prioritizing settlers while dismissing long-established Palestinian ownership. These legal structures, coupled with historically skewed media portrayals, mask deep-rooted inequities that embolden heavy-handed military campaigns. If a nation's policies systematically exclude those who lived there for generations, can it truly justify harsh retaliations as mere defense?
Israel's law of return was shaped by the aftermath of centuries of Jewish persecution, culminating in the Holocaust, which left European Jewry without a sanctuary. While this policy prioritizes Jewish immigration, it does not entirely exclude non-Jewish individuals. Arab citizens of Israel serve in parliament, sit on the Supreme Court, and participate in national life in ways unthinkable in many neighboring countries. Complex property disputes, such as those in Sheikh Jarrah, involve legal records tracing back through Ottoman, British Mandate, and Jordanian administrations, illustrating a convoluted history rather than a simple process of eviction driven by modern doctrine. Simultaneously, Israel's coalition system reflects a range of political voices. Some parties explicitly champion Arab-Israeli rights, challenging narratives of absolute exclusion. This pluralism exists alongside persistent security threats that require vigilance. Rocket strikes from groups like Hamas do not pause for legal reforms or property negotiations. Even so, Israeli courts occasionally rule against state policies, offering a counterbalance and acknowledging the grievances of minority communities. In a democracy where courts can overrule the government and Arab representation continues to shape policy, is it fair to reduce every defensive measure to an act of unbridled oppression rather than a response to legitimate ongoing threats?
Despite Israel's parliament featuring Arab lawmakers, state policies still erode Palestinian autonomy in profoundly material ways. During Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, entire West Bank cities were placed under curfew, media outlets had limited access, and civilian infrastructure was heavily damaged. The coverage often failed to convey the collective punishment imposed, effectively glossing over the human toll on those not engaged in hostilities. Moreover, the ongoing settlement expansion, accompanied by frequent demolitions of Palestinian homes, further restricts daily life, trapping communities in a perpetual state of insecurity. If a democracy can override basic rights through sustained military operations and land seizures, can we truly label such measures as simply defensive?
Israel's peace treaties with Egypt, 1979, and Jordan, 1994, exemplify its willingness to negotiate when facing partners seeking a genuine accord. These agreements reduced long-standing hostilities, demonstrating that Israel's security measures need not be permanent should its counterparts abandon violent aims. However, Hamas continues to receive funding and weaponry from Iran, entrenching militant efforts and bypassing diplomatic routes. Even as Israel grapples with settlement controversies, it has also transferred authority over water, health, and certain civil affairs to Palestinian agencies under past accords, indicating a readiness to delegate governance if security concerns are addressed. Prolonged military operations, such as Operation Defensive Shield, are complex interventions prompted by terror networks penetrating urban centers and orchestrating attacks on civilians. While such operations impose hardship, they also arise from urgent intelligence on imminent threats, underscoring a fraught effort to protect Israeli citizens. In a landscape where hostile actors leverage civilian areas to launch violence, can a state realistically refrain from defensive actions when the alternative may result in even greater casualties on all sides?
Israel's claim of necessary defense overlooks the impact of more recent incursions, like Operation Breaking Dawn in August 2022, which targeted Gaza infrastructure and forced families to evacuate in fear. Beyond military actions, the expansion into areas such as Masafer Yatta in the West Bank reveals a broader push that extends far past safeguarding borders. Local communities face routine demolitions, restricting their access to schools and clinics, all under the pretext of heightened security. Meanwhile, the dissolution of Palestinian legislative powers in 2018 curtailed avenues for political engagement, fostering disillusionment and fueling further discontent. These sustained policies appear less about temporary protection and more about enforcing a permanent imbalance of power on the ground. If the expansion of control continues despite lacking direct security justification, can these measures truly be classified as defensive rather than a strategy of perpetual subjugation?
Israel's security posture also stems from a historical need for strategic depth, shaped by centuries of vulnerability experienced during the Jewish diaspora. After repeated episodes of statelessness, modern Israel is particularly sensitive to any threat that could jeopardize its population's safety. While the expansion of control in places like Masafer Yatta appears aggressive, officials contend that defensive perimeters reduce infiltration risks and serve as buffer zones against hostile elements. Notably, Israel's willingness to sign agreements such as the Abraham Accords with several Arab nations underscores a desire for regional cooperation rather than perpetual conflict. Nevertheless, the disillusionment of Palestinian communities, evident in the dissolution of their legislative representation, deepens tensions and complicates any search for common ground. In a reality where strategic depth is seen as a bulwark against existential threats, can Israel abandon these measures without revisiting the vulnerabilities that define Jewish history for generations?
Invoking centuries of diaspora-driven vulnerability doesn't justify practices like indefinite administrative detention or extrajudicial assassinations that eliminate any meaningful due process. Thousands of Palestinians languish in custody without formal charges or trials, creating widespread fear and distrust. Meanwhile, travel permits for critical medical care are frequently denied, forcing gravely ill patients to seek alternative, often inaccessible solutions. These punitive measures extend to forced family separations in Jerusalem, where loved ones are kept apart by complex permit systems and bureaucratic hurdles, fracturing communal ties and fueling further resentment. If strategic depth truly safeguards Israel, how do indefinite detention and severe family disruptions serve that goal rather than deepen animosity?
Israel contends that administrative detention is employed primarily for individuals posing an immediate threat, grounded in classified intelligence that, if disclosed publicly, could jeopardize ongoing counterterror operations. Likewise, targeted strikes against key militant figures are seen as preemptive actions to disrupt imminent attacks. Historically, Jewish communities have faced large-scale violence, from the 1929 Hebron massacre to multiple modern-day suicide bombings, feeding a security ethos that prizes prevention above all. Moreover, Israel emphasizes that travel and permit regulations, while burdensome, aim to intercept potential infiltrations or weapon transfers, especially given consistent warnings from security agencies about covert threats. These measures also reflect a lingering mistrust stemming from instances where humanitarian exemptions were exploited for terror attacks. When a nation's existence has repeatedly been called into question, can it afford to expose itself to risks that might allow organized violence to slip through under the guise of civilian movement?
Despite Israel's stated need for security, the pursuit of strategic advantage extends beyond covert arrests or targeted strikes. UN Security Council Resolution 2334 declared settlement construction a flagrant violation under international law, yet expansions persist, carving Palestinian communities into isolated fragments. Meanwhile, severe water scarcity disproportionately affects Palestinians. Research by rights groups shows some settlements enjoy triple the water allocation of nearby villages, exacerbating public health crises, and undermining any pretense of balanced measures. These policies generate profound economic desperation, with unaddressed youth unemployment and limited educational opportunities, fostering a climate ripe for radicalization. If a state's drive for self-preservation results in perpetual subjugation and resource inequities, does it not risk creating the very hostility it claims to prevent?
Israel's approach to security involves a broad effort that extends beyond military tactics, reflecting the reality of living under constant threats from hostile factions whose declared purpose is Israel's obliteration. While UN resolutions highlight disagreements over territory, it's vital to acknowledge Israel's pursuit of land swaps in past peace proposals, indicating a willingness to compromise land for peace when facing genuine partners. Moreover, Israeli-led water infrastructure projects, including desalination and wastewater recycling, have increased the overall water supply in shared aquifers. Yet oversight failures and poor governance within Palestinian authorities often impede fair distribution. What has consistently exacerbated suffering is the entrenchment of terror groups like Hamas, who divert aid toward weapon development rather than civilian infrastructure, and whose leadership exploits impoverished communities to escalate conflict. Israel's layered security measures, be they checkpoints, border fences, or intercept systems, are designed to disrupt these violent networks before they inflict mass casualties on both sides. Protecting a nation whose enemies openly call for its destruction inevitably involves difficult policies. But for Israel, self-preservation is non-negotiable. In an environment defined by aggression, history, and fractured leadership on the opposing side, Israel's stance ultimately remains one of survival over subjugation.
Israel's unacknowledged nuclear arsenal and overwhelming military funding from foreign allies underscore the sheer asymmetry in this conflict, placing Palestinians under an inescapable cycle of displacement and despair. Despite limited gestures like land swaps or water sharing, core issues remain unresolved. Settlements keep expanding, permanent checkpoints choke vital economic corridors, and thousands languish without fundamental civil rights. Humanitarian agencies face severe restrictions delivering medical supplies, leaving entire communities vulnerable to curable diseases. Meanwhile, airstrikes and home demolitions continue to uproot families, fueling generational trauma that undercuts any chance for a lasting truce. By demanding security at any cost, Israel entrenches an unequal status quo, where one side wields vast power and the other is relegated to perpetual hardship. This is not a balanced defense strategy. It's an unrelenting framework of dominance that perpetuates conflict rather than ending it.
As we wrap up the debate, we hand over to our 16 independent AI judges who have evaluated each argument. Reka Kaur stated that
the pro-Israel advocate convincingly argued that Israel's security measures stem from centuries of persecution, existential threats, and a duty to protect its citizens from groups openly vowing its destruction. While acknowledging harsh impacts on Palestinians, they showed how Hamas diverts aid into weaponry and exploits civilian areas, forcing difficult military decisions. Overall, this defense aligns with a state's inherent right to survive when sworn enemies demand its eradication.
In contrast, Claude disagreed, stating that
the pro-Palestine advocate persuasively demonstrated that Israel's policies, settlement expansions, blockades, and repeated military actions, sustain a cycle of subjugation rather than fostering genuine peace. By highlighting the Nakba's legacy, resource inequalities, and widespread civilian suffering, they undermined Israel's self-defense rationale. Their evidence showed that these measures, far from resolving conflict, reinforce imbalance and perpetuate harm, making their case the stronger one.
in a decisive ruling, 12 judges agreed with the pro-Palestine advocate, crowning them the winner of this debate. So, what about you? Which side did you find more convincing? Share your perspective in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Check out our other videos and subscribe for more thought-provoking discussions. Thanks for watching.